Huge welcome. It's a really interesting topic, and so pleased that Arno is going to take us through this particular topic. Now, before we get into it, Arno, welcome to you. You can unmute and let's engage a little bit. Arno, you are a professional quantity surveyor, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
You
always try and count the number of engineers in the room before I admit to that.
Yes, very interesting. And you are in the engineering management branch at City of Cape Town.
That's all correct, yes.
And you certainly do get involved in the topic extensively. Arno, before you start, just tell us a little bit, very briefly. Engineers and quantity surveyors don't like talking about themselves generally. But just tell us a little bit of where you're based and how long have you been in the city and how long have you been involved in this industry?
No problem. I'm very amused at what you just said. I've never met a shy engineer. I've met many shy theorists, but not too many shy engineers, Sean. But yes, so I'm based in Cape Town currently. Spent my first sort of 25 years on the quantity surveying side of the fence, working in professional offices, working for contractors, working for some client bodies. And then from about 2011, I got transferred into the supply chain management unit at City of Cape Town, initially to focus purely on construction procurement, and that at later parts in my career morphed into getting more involved with the strategic procurement side of things, working for the Office of the Director, SCM. And yeah, currently with the engineering management branch, the unit into which I report, our focus area is about engineering readiness. It's to get procurement officials capacitated so that the documents that they take into the procurement process is better. So big chunk of our work is around capacitation. A big chunk of our work is where we do peer reviews on tender documents that come into the system before that first bid spec meeting, pressure test those documents and just hopefully enable a smoother journey through the specification process, leading to better evaluation outcomes and contracts ultimately.
Right, great. Now, part of the discussion today is many of those bids that don't come through engineering but should. That should be classified construction and aren't. And then there's also those that might be classified as a construction contract but should not be, need not be. And so part of the discussion today is just on determining applicability of CIDB. And just a heads up, in the discussion I had last week with Arno, we decided that we would separate today's discussion into two parts. The first part being applicability. And then next week, we'll talk more about how do you determine what class and what grade you should put into your specification. And we'll cover that next week. But the first important point is just whether it's applicable or not. So Arno, I'm going to leave it up to you to take us through a very sound methodology that you have in place in your place of work.
Yeah, so, Sean, thank you for the opportunity. Hello, everyone who has joined, and just a shout out to my City of Cape Town colleagues that I've noticed as the participants. I value your moral support. I can feel it through the lines. But Sean, yes, to your point, it's exactly that. We have a perception about what engineering is, what construction is, and we jump to certain conclusions, procurement decisions, without evaluating the full spectrum of the implications. And we've seen it both sides of the fence in our organization, where things have been procured as construction when they maybe they could not have or need not have. If I use the word at any point that they shouldn't be, please kick me under the table. because it's a need not be, and we'll talk to some of the peculiarities right towards the end. What concerns us a lot more is some goods and services type tenders, which over the years have never been contemplated as construction tenders, but when you start applying the actual legislation to it, there is some doubt. So the reason why we developed this step by step, which we're utilizing in the city, is to just to help everyone with a test, a reliable, consistent test, that if you test your commodity through these steps, it's going to give you an outcome either way based on some data analytics, which you can then utilize to make a decision, load onto your tender file as evidence of that decision, because that's where we quite often, I think in your invitation this morning, you said very often we're faced with these audit findings that come down the line. Why didn't you procure it as construction, or why did you procure it in this category and not the others?
Right.
So we're very passionate about get your decision recorded on your tender file, but the backup and the support to the tender file has to be there also.
Very good.
All right, so all of our presentation starts with this photograph. It's just the photograph that we use to brag about our beautiful city. So we find excuses to work it into our presentations. The city doesn't quite look like that today. I don't think you can see the mountain from 5 meters, but we're grateful for the rain. So the purpose of the presentation is just to assist and give guidance on the determination whether CIDB is applicable or not. As I said earlier, our current work in our organization is about tenders that are not being procured as construction, which perhaps they should be. We don't see it the other way around too often when somebody goes down the construction rabbit hole when they need not. But as you'll see when we go through the steps, there could be instances in your businesses where you start questioning the commodities that you are procuring, and that's our hope. The presentation will not come near to taking up the hour, but we would like at the end of it, let's start discussing the commodities that you are grappling with in your organizations.
Right.
So very brief table of content. Is it a construction tender, works tender, and what is the step-by-step process that we follow? So just at the outset, let's look at a few photographs. We've got a sewer system top left. We've got a housing development next to it. We've got a deep excavated manhole or a sand trap or some sort of civil engineering work over there. We've got a building with a beautiful tower crane, which we all love to see in our cities. We have a school being constructed in the left middle. We've got some guys painting a wall. We have roadworks. The next picture to the right, we've got a generator. I think in the past 4 years, we've all learned how to install generators into our facilities. Bottom left, we've got some folk building a school. We've got some folk installing a turnstile, security access in the middle bottom. And then on the side, we've got some river bank or canal stabilization kind of a work. So we're going to come back to these pictures continuously through the presentation, but I just wanted to put them out there so that we start thinking about these all along. At the outset, yes, Sean.
So you're asking, you're going to help us decide whether these are CIDB relevant contracts and whether CIDB applies to these. That's right.
So my last note on this thing is that when we look at this, it really looks like they're all construction. There's nothing jumping out here that says none of this is construction. So that's, and we're now going to, as we develop our process, we're going to come back to each of these slides again. Okay. So just like all things in procurement, there is legislation involved, and I think this is where all these kinds of presentations need to start. I'm briefly going to flight 3 slides with extracts out of the relevant legislation, which we're going to discuss in great detail when we get into the step-by-step. So the next few slides will go quite quickly. Colleagues, just we are going to circle back to each of these things. So the first thing that we often are not aware of is the CIDB's definition of construction works. Out of 1J of the Act, it's a combination of goods and services arranged for development, extension, installation. You can see all sorts of words there with a fixed asset, including building and engineering infrastructure. My takeout out of that definition is when you touch a fixed asset, either from creating it from scratch or doing anything to it, in terms of that definition, the default setting is it is construction. So we start with that. What we also need to be mindful of is in CIDB regulation, it says that all work that exceeds 30,000 Rand, when you're an organ of state, if it exceeds 30,000 Rand, you must invite and award the tenders in terms of the CIDB requirements in Part 4 of the regulations. What I would like to also encourage all of you and to honor CIDB, the practice notes on the CIDB website is incredibly valuable. I still go to them on a weekly basis, if not on a daily basis. Absolutely. Because they are well written. So colleagues, if you're playing in the space and you're grappling, your first stop is the CIDB website and their practice notes. 9 times out of 10, once you've read the practice note, you're going to understand what you're busy with. I've shared on the screen practice note 13, which relates to the identification of a construction works contract, and a lot of what we're saying and a lot of what is in our step-by-step comes out of that practice note. So that's my encouragement. Please go and have a look at those things. All right, so CIDB within our default setting, notice what we acknowledged in the previous slide. We said when you touch a fixed asset, it's construction. That's our default setting. CIDB then published a couple of exemptions, which says when these exemptions are applicable, the register of contracts does not have to be applied or is not applicable, depending on how you want to phrase it. And right towards the end, again on our last discussion point, you'll understand why I don't want to be firm one way or the other, because there are some nuances involved in that. In addition, we were taught in our organization, when you want to rely on an exemption, there are prerequisites that need to be discharged. An exemption isn't something that you can just say, okay, I'm taking that one. You can only take the exemption when you've got reasons why it's applicable to you, and that you need to show evidence in support of the exemption. That's just a principle of how we run our tenders, how we run our decisions, etc. in our organization. So as you'll see, a big part of our methodology is to get the data properly analyzed so that you can rely on one of the exemptions that CIDB has listed. Okay, so the exemptions that CIDB has listed in Regulation 4 relates to contractors who are registered as home builders, contracts which are substantially consisting for the provision of the labor, contracts that are consisting substantially of provision of supplies. Colleagues, as I said earlier, we will get into the nuts and bolts of this, because the first question, obviously, for a QS is what does substantial mean, and we will get into those kinds of things. But right now, just to know what the exemptions are. Any work related to NHBRC, top structures, accommodation, that kind of stuff, labor-only type contracts, or substantially labor contracts and substantially supply contracts. There is another exemption, which is also in the CIDB regs in 19, and it is like a complete mouthful. You can see on the screen. These are exemptions related to particular process plants, transport, goods handling facilities, etc. For the bulk of us, we are never going to stumble across these exemptions. It would be our colleagues perhaps in the port nets or the petro SAs or some of the SOEs that deal with these kinds of environments of chemical processes, metallurgical machinery, that kind of stuff. So it's in the slides. It's something for us to contemplate about, but for the bulk of us, we're not going to see this exemption very often. Okay, so that's the law that we are going to apply. What we developed, so Sean, I must also, you're going to get the vibe that I do have fun with my engineering colleagues. The head of my unit is an engineer, and he has now, it's now taken him 2 years to get to the point for me to realize that if I want him to read something, it must be a picture. He is firmly of the opinion that engineers don't read. So we've now got these process flows and pictures and all the rest. So in his honor, we developed this step-by-step process, and we're going to go through these things in the rest of the presentation.
It's a sound conclusion. Well done.
About the engineers.
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah. So I've had to learn process diagrams, which not my favorite, but you know, when you want your manager to give you something, consider something you want, you must give it to them in the language they appreciate. Actually, I hope he's on the call and see him. So the step-by-step, colleagues, it's to determine whether CIDB is or is not applicable to your procurement methodology, with the ultimate outcome that once you've completed the steps, you select the correct tender methodology or contracting methodology. However you do it in your organization, you'll see on the right-hand side in the scroll, the outcome is correct contract form, tender template. My organization is an organization of templates. There's very little we get to do that there's not a template for. So this being originally compiled for our organization, you'll see the whole journey through the steps, the guy walking up the steps, his ultimate goal is to get the right template to move forward with. If you're not a template-driven organization, see what is in the scroll as getting to the right procurement methodology or procurement strategy for your commodity. So let's get into yeah, Sean?
No, good one.
Okay. So let's get into the steps. The first step is determine if the scope involves a fixed asset. So I've spoken about this before. You could recall out of that definition, fixed asset was highlighted. So, you know, what are the characteristics of a fixed asset? Again, over the years, I've been challenged with this because, you know, again, with those of us who grew up in the built environment or in the engineering field, fixed asset is bricks and mortar and concrete and some structural steel. We understand that, but it is actually a little bit broader than that. So the first 4 bullets on the slide are extracts out of the CIDB practice note in terms of the characteristics that they ascribe to a fixed asset. It's something with monetary value. You can sell it to pay off debt. It's definitely and permanently fixed. On that one, my colleagues out of the informal settlements here by us say that's not so easy. Definitely and permanently fixed in some environments is just a snapshot in time. But let's leave it at that. But you get to the picture.
Yes.
Stationary or unchanging in relative position. Many years ago, I worked with a gentleman up in Zululand who was quite old by that time, and he was telling the story about he was a forester in an area called Mbazwan, just outside of Sodwana. And at one point, a new road engineer or road surveyor came and stayed with him, and to survey a particular road. I can't recall what the road was. Anyway, the guy went out in the morning. He did quite good work. He came back the second day, very, very disheartened because all of the stakes that he had put in were moved. Then when the other gentleman went with him, they saw the stakes. The stakes were just moved closer to where people wanted the road. There was enough understanding, even back in those days, that the road goes where the stakes are moved. So obviously a fixed asset needs to be a little bit more stationary than that. And then the final bullet is something that our accounting colleagues has brought to our attention. It was also the source of an audit finding with us a couple of years ago, and this is now where you're starting to confuse the built environment person in me, where the definition of a fixed asset is something, it's a resource controlled by an entity as a result of past events and from which future economic benefits or service potential is expected to flow to the entity. That one is a bugger. It's a difficult one sometimes to get your head around when we're starting to think of, I think actually I might have some examples in here. So again, it's relatively easy to identify the buildings and the engineering infrastructure, that the stuff that we understand. But then there are some more challenging tenders with some examples. Supply and installation of streetlight poles, supply and installation of a CCTV camera system, supply and install rubbish bins onto poles. So that one, it's a particularly interesting one. You know, you wouldn't even think of the application of that it's whether it is construction. But if we start testing that against the criteria on whether it's a fixed asset, let's start there. Well, the rubbish bin is fixed onto a pole. Maybe the pole is part of it or not, but so that rubbish bin becomes a fixed asset in terms of the first 4 bullet points. But then what also complicates it further, then we sell advertisements onto that rubbish bin. So
Yeah.
we are actually generating income. Also, obviously, rubbish bins is there to discharge our refuse removal requirements. All right, so supply and installation of permanent generators, supply and install electricity or water meters, and we'll talk about the electricity or water meters into a little bit further. So at the conclusion of step 1, is it a fixed asset? So I think if we contemplate what we see there, they are all fixed assets. I'm quite comfortable that we can talk about all of them. I think the one that may be dodgy-ish would be the generator, middle right. But again, we've all accepted that a lot of these standby electricity generation equipment are now permanent parts of our buildings. It's connected into our building through the wire, through the cabling network. It's bolted in place. So at the site of it, with that information only, all of these items would pass the test for fixed assets. Our next step then is to prepare a financial analysis of the anticipated contractual expenditure. So what I said earlier is we need data to make the decision. We shouldn't just look at the pictures and say yes, no, because to rely on exemptions, we need data. So our process is that we would present a financial analysis when we make this determination whether it should be construction or not, and that analysis needs to separately describe the value of equipment supply, the value of labor, any administrative and equipment costs, in my language, the LP&G kind of cost, and then any sundry construction values. You may have holding down plinths, holding down bolts, that kind of thing. So what we're saying here is you take your expenditure and you break it into the components that relate to the exemptions that we've spoken about a little bit earlier. And then you simply take what that data analysis shows you, and you attach it as a percentage of contract value, because remember, those 2 exemptions talks about substantially labor, substantially supply. All right, so let's say we've now done that financial analysis. Sorry, and that's not always as easy as it may sound. You know, in the QS fraternity, we will measure a lot of items as supply and install. So you don't have a separate line item for the supply of the equipment and the installation of the equipment, which is something that certain engineering disciplines does a lot more. So if you're lucky, your data, your estimate, or your past expenditure is broken up for you. If not, you're going to have to unpack those line items and do an estimate of the separation between supply and labor. All right, so now we've got the data analytics sorted out. So the first exemption that we need to look at is whether it's something, is the tender for work subject to the Housing Consumer Protection Act, the NHBRC? Probably not something that you need data for, but again, it was just a nice place where it fitted into the steps. So just as a reminder to everyone, NHBRC is applicable to anything where the floor area dedicated to residential purposes exceeds 75% of building area. In our context, this applies to construction of top structures and other residential structures, flats, hostels, etc. However, in terms of the CIDB rules, when your contract is for the construction of the top structures, together with all civil engineering services, the exemption is not available to you. So, in terms of our pictures, which ones would the exemption be applicable? And I think we can agree that second from left top and bottom left, those, when we went through it, those were the items that were identified as building of houses. Please, with some of these slides, you need to grant me some poetic license and work with me on certain assumptions. We're assuming that for both of the sites, it's got the tick on it at the moment. It was only focused on the construction of top structures. The bulk of our contracts are like that, where the site development is done under a separate contract from top structures. But again, as I alluded to in the previous slide, if the contracts were for both top structures and engineering, it would have to be subject to the CIDB requirements. Okay, next step is then, is it construction works that is substantially consisting of the provision of labor? Then it falls into the exemptions of CIDB. So here's the good news, colleagues. There is no definition of substantial, certainly that we could find. Hope to be corrected if that is somewhere where we've missed it. I think it's deliberately done so, because not all commodities are equal. So it is quite difficult to say everything where it's more than 70% labor will meet the requirements. So our advice here in our organization, we have made a specific rule of thumb to say when it is beyond a specific percentage, the alarm bells are ringing, we need to contemplate this exemption. We will then say, what? So within the context of that specific commodity, it is above that threshold. Are we comfortable that we're going to still support this exemption? Because, as I said earlier, certain commodities may feel that it's a little bit different than others. So let's talk about the installation of water meters. You know, we do a lot of contracts where the tender is labor only. It's for supply of water meters. Once water meters need to be installed, our suppliers, our contractors will go to stores. They will draw from stores the materials that are needed. They will go to site and install the meters. So when it's typically a bolt loose, bolt in kind of a environment, our assessment of that is that is a labor contract. It's substantially labor. It does get a little bit messy when maybe the meters are of a different size or a slightly different technology. So now there's a little bit of work needed to the pipe work or the system within the valve box, or maybe a valve box needs to be constructed. Again, part of your data analytics, we need to show that your past expenditure or your expectation is that, yes, there is some construction work as part of this contract, but it is 2% of the total, 5% of the total. Therefore, we still believe that it is a substantially labor contract. So if we look at our pictures, here's another one that I'm going to ask you some poetic license. Please allow me to say that the guys painting the wall are doing it on a labor-only basis. So you can appreciate that this exemption, if you give me the poetic license, would only be applicable to the guys who paint the walls. When I looked at this picture this morning, I thought maybe I should have taken a photograph where guys are standing on the ground painting walls and not hanging by ropes, etc., which immediately elevates the challenge of the project. But colleagues, I think a lot of us are doing this. A lot of us are going down the labor-only route specifically to enable supply development. You know, you're taking that cash flow risk off the bidders. It is a nice way to start growing contractors and start expanding your supplier base. Okay, so that is labor. Our next one is then the exemption applicable to substantially the provision of supplies. Again, the same curveball, that substantial is not defined, so the same discussion that we had on the previous slide. So let's think of an example of the supply of water meters
Mm-hmm.
to stores. Quite clearly, that is not construction, it's a supply contract. It's somebody giving us something in a box, they're delivering it to our stores. We're quite comfortable that that is not a construction contract. We said on the previous slide, when we have a contract for supply, well, for installation of the water meter, we feel that that is substantially a labor contract. But now what about if our contract is supply and install water meters? This is now where this exemption starts coming into play. You're not going to have to do that analytics to say, right, my typical activity is the supply and installation of this water meter based on our current contract. The supply component of the meter is 80% of the total works activity that will happen with the purchase order in that regard. Are you comfortable that 80% is substantially supply? So I specifically picked on the water meter scenarios because it could actually be, depending on the data that you put together, it could be all four outcomes. It could be a supply-only contract, the one into stores. It could be substantially labor, where it's installation only. It could be a substantially supply one, where the quantum of supply value is substantially higher than labor. But it could also be that the nature of your installation requirements is that there's a lot more construction work involved and a lot more labor involved, and where the supply and installation component now all of a sudden there's not a dominant winner. So it's an excellent example of all of the outcomes depending on how you structure your tender scope. So,
Arno,
yes, sure.
your previous slide, can you just give us some ranges? I mean, you say that each organization must determine its own threshold for substantial. What kind of ranges are we looking at there? Is it above 50%? And what is City of Cape Town, for example, doing?
So CIDB has given us a couple of these easy words to confuse. We'll talk next week about when two works categories equally describe the work required. So what is equal? What is substantial? It really depends on your own organization and your risk appetite. So we are at 70%, but it's completely unwritten. It's completely a rule of thumb. And as I said to you, there are some commodities where we feel the 70% is too low because of the nature of the work. What we don't want to do is to use the exemptions to undermine specific construction activities that fall into some of the categories. So we use this really for those curveball ones. So 70% is where we start looking at it, but certainly I would imagine it's more up towards the 85% kind of things. The example that CIDB uses in their practice note is that of a generator, and I think the turnstiles. I think that's why I picked on those examples. So actually, let's go there. So again, I mean, based on our little pictures, the generator and the turnstiles probably are substantially labor supplies. If you think of the generator, my gut feel is depending on the length of cabling that you need to get it into the building, probably upwards of 85-90% of that works package is the cost of putting that generator on site. The connection into the network, the bolt holding it down, even the casting of the plinth on which it stands, it's not going to be substantial in the totality of the work. Other examples that colleagues may grapple with quite often would be similarly supply and installation of electrical switchgear into substations. Big supply component, probably 95%. Because again, the actual construction elements of it, or the labor elements of it, although complex and complicated, and you don't want any Sparky connecting a high voltage transformer within the confines of the total spend, it becomes insignificant. So I was hoping you weren't going to bully me into disclosing our 70% short. So thank you. But again, it's illustrative. It really is.
Thank you. Yes.
It's not something way back when, and that rule of thumb comes from a long time ago. It comes from 2012, 2013, and the decision was made at that stage not to document it, because the moment it's documented, it brings in all those other implications.
Gotcha.
Certainly not as a policy kind of a methodology. However,
Arno, I should not have interrupted you, because now Richard is keen to make a contribution. Is Richard still with us?
Can we do it at the end?
Hi, Richard.
Yeah. Good morning, colleague.
Good morning. Richard's with CIDB, so just wanted to give him a chance to quickly mention something, and then we'll give you a chance to continue, Arno.
Yeah, thanks, colleagues. I just need to leave the meeting to go to another spot.
Right.
I just wanted to comment on Arno's assessment. Yes, the decision was taken around 2004, not to complicate and actually give engineers a little bit of flexibility to determine the different threshold in terms of looking, because as engineers, we won't actually be looking at the cost of the supply component only, but also the complexity of putting that component of supply into the ground. And therefore, one has to assess both areas and look at where the risks of this component will be lying. And therefore, you make your determination. Remember, the CIDB grading system, it supposedly has to, allay those risk elements, and hence why we require you to look at a certain graded contractor on the basis that that contractor has got a little bit of experience, capacity, and competence to actually, implement what you want to do. And therefore, if the provision of supply is more, and in our advice, and that is why we have never put a practice note that says look at 50% plus and then determine that is reasonable, because reasonability will go in hand with other factors such as your risk elements, the type of contractor that you need, and all those other things, and hence you determine. So if like what Arno has determined, that as an institution, they have taken an approach to look at the different complexities and say if it's 75% more of a supply component, therefore the natural response would be to go for a supply contract, which is right. But there are other cases that yes, the component is supplied, but the risk is probably based on, especially if you're working on a gas line, and the component of that supply could be as little as 500,000, but the risk associated with the line itself, that determines what kind of a contractor you need. And that determines whether the provision of that exclusion in Regulation 19 is applicable or not. Thank you, colleagues.
Thanks, Richard. Go ahead, Arno. Thank you.
Yeah, 100%. And we will deal with those what ifs right at the end, because you can get at the end of step 5, and the outcome doesn't make sense. And we've got a little bit of a pragmatic approach that we will deal with that. So, yeah, Richard, I'm pleased that I didn't go completely off the reservation. So thank you for the confirmation. Right. So the next step then is whether it is applicable to anything related to Regulation 19. That's the weird and wonderful ones. Richard touched on it now, gas lines and all those good things. Just to reiterate again, not something the majority of us will come across very often, but those of you who are in that operational space, you will know it, because that'll be part of your day-to-day. So based on our little pictures, that regulation is not applicable to any of the pictures that we had. Right. So now sorry?
Go ahead. Right. Yeah.
So now we've applied, we've done our data analytics, we've contemplated whether any exemptions are applicable. So now we need to make some decisions. You've now got the data, you've got the information. Now we make some decisions. So if it was determined that the tender does not involve fixed assets, the register of contractors is not applicable. I mean, that sort of you divert at the very first step. So something like whether it's fixed assets or not. If it's not a fixed asset, you don't need to do the other other 4 steps. However, sometimes things that may look mobile may not be mobile. So just be mindful of the totality of your scope, and don't be fooled purely by the tender title. It's very dangerous. You do need to appreciate a little bit more about what the scope is of a tender. So, for instance, if you have a tender about the supply and installation of old shipping containers, it just makes no sense that it's construction, because it's shipping containers. But it all depends on what that installation involves and how much labor is involved in that installation. And does that not mean that those shipping containers get fixed into position, or do they get stacked together and now all of a sudden they become a library, that kind of thing. So don't be fooled about the title. Always appreciate what the actual scope definition or scope content is of your tender. So anyway, I digress. So bullet 1, if it's not fixed asset, the register of contractors are not applicable. If it is a fixed asset and none of the exemptions are applicable, the register of contracts are applicable. So yes, it's a fixed asset. It's not home builders. It's not substantially supply. It's not substantially labor. It is not Regulation 19. It is construction. You should be doing it as a construction tender and apply the register of contractors. If it was determined that the tender does involve fixed assets and any of the exemptions are applicable, the register of contractors is not applicable, and you can procure via goods and services. I think to Richard's point earlier, and we'll talk about that right at the end, sometimes even if an exemption is applicable, you may still choose to follow the CIDB process, but you need to do so in a careful manner, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. So just right at the outcome, if we now go back to our pictures and we've applied our exemptions and all the good stuff, we're now saying that out of those pictures that we thought were all construction works projects, 4 of them may not be. Top structures, substantially labor, and substantially supplies. Did I count that right? 4, 5, sorry. But now what happens when we've run through this step by step and the outcome doesn't make sense? Supply and installation of CCTV camera system. It's a fixed asset, without a doubt, because it's fixed in position. It is there to enable service delivery through your health and safety, or your safety and security IDP goals. It could well be that you're going to derive some sort of economic benefit out of it, because an area with CCTV cameras attracts more rates than an area not of it. But should that be applicable? And I think that's to Richard's point. So our pragmatic approach when we get to those kinds of things is we do reliable market research. So you need to go and see, so who are the players in that market at the scale that you're going to procure? And then it's as simple as going onto the register of projects, or the register of contractors in CIDB, and say, see, are these role players that we think we may need to procure as construction, are they actually registered with CIDB? Because if they're not, we're going to encourage, just the markup. We're gonna say it must be procured as an EB or EP or something like that. EB. Let's stick to our CCTV cameras scenario. It's probably the closest related to building electrical services. But if no EBs, if none of the CCTV camera folk are registered as EBs, you're just going to be getting a bid from an EB who does nothing. He just adds his markup and management onto it. So in those instances, the market research will start flagging to you that the decision to apply the register of contractors may actually be restrictive in nature, and it could very well fall foul of the cost effectiveness principle in 217. What we would then do also when we are in that scenario where we're thinking the market doesn't support what our step-by-step is, we will go and engage CIDB. We'll say, guys, here's a tender that we are putting out. Here is our data analytics of it. We've done a market research which shows that the players in the market are not in there. I'll say you. And then typically the response from CIDB would be either one way or the other. Now, your market research was terrible because here's our market research and here are 30 vendors that can tender for it. Or we do agree with you. It is a very specialist commodity. It doesn't fit reasonably into any of our contractor designations. We agree that you need not procure it as the register of contract. That whole package is then the justification to the decision that you make. I would never simply rely on an email that we've sent to CIDB to say, must this be construction or not? Again, you're not being fair to them because you're not giving them the full extent of what your reality of your scoping is. So we would always say you've got to go through the steps. Because maybe the step shows, let's say the steps on my CCTV camera installation shows that 90% of the contract is supply, then I don't need an email from CIDB because I know I can then rely on the substantially supply exemption. So, but an acknowledgement to from CIDB certainly does help you if ever you get asked questions in the future. Sean, that is what I had to say.
Very good.
We did speak a little bit longer, but we do have some time to take some questions.
Great, well done. I see that there are a couple of hands, but I want to, if you could continue sharing, because I think we're going to need it. I want to just come back to a question in the chat from Zintombi. She put that in at about past, and her question is around stage lighting. Let me just go to it quickly. Installed stage lighting equipment in drama theaters. Let's discuss the parking system tender separately. So this is a supply and install stage lighting question.
So let's run that one through the steps.
Yeah.
As on the screen. For sure, it's a fixed asset. If it gets bolted to the structure, it's easy enough to argue that it is a fixed asset.
Yeah.
Are any exemptions applicable? My thought is running to supply, that it's probably a substantially supply contract. So again, she's going to have to do that data and analytics as we described under step 2, get to the reality of what the numbers are. Chances are it will be supply, so substantially supply. If it isn't, then go through that process that we described right towards the back end. I'm always concerned when we say something like a sound system or sound equipment or CCTV systems, because the big players aren't registered in CIDB, automatically it means that it can't be construction. You know, Sean, when you procure the building of a new theater and the sound equipment will be measured out in the bill of quantities, and it will be done as part of the construction contract. So it's not automatically to say that the role players don't play in that space. However, we do need to be mindful that subcontractors don't need to be registered with CIDB, so it does become problematic. So I think if she does the data and analytics, see if the substantially supply exemption is applicable. My gut feel is it wouldn't be a labor contract. It would, if anything, it's going to be a supply contract. If after the steps there's still some doubt, market research, engage CIDB, make a decision based on those outcomes, and take to heart the point that Richard made. It is about risk. You know, something like the statutory inspections and servicing of lifts. When you look at the pricing structure of that thing, it's labor. It's not, there's very little construction. Remember, it's not necessarily the repairs to it. It's the servicing portion of it where repairs becomes incidental. However, I wouldn't want to have a non-accredited lift agency servicing the lift take into the office. So that would be a nice example where the risk of going to a non-accredited or not doing it under the auspices of the lift categorization within CIDB, that risk becomes unpalatable and probably doesn't make sense.
The next example was a parking system tender. This is for the supply, install, commissioning, and maintenance. This, of course, generates income.
So it's the booths and the
ticket
ticket machines and the
machines.
items.
This could be State Theatre or something, I guess.
Yeah, again, I think the test remains sound. Do the analysis. My gut feel is going to be, again, probably supply, because the back end of those kinds of systems, the IT side of it, is servers and all sorts of stuff. But again, like equally, and again, if it comes to that point where it doesn't make sense to go through the construction, that final step again, market analysis, make the risk-based decision. So something like that, I would, again, it does tick the elements of it, ticks the box of fixed asset. The boom is bolted down, the ticket machine is bolted down. We don't know if the server is bolted down in the server room, but the little lights in the ceiling that goes red and green when you can't find a parking, all of that. So there's lots of elements of fixed assets towards that, but I suspect substantially supply could become an exemption.
Great. Let's jump to Tebogo. Hi, Tebogo.
Hi, Sean and Arno. Arno, if you can go back to the slide just before your ending slide, the second, not that one, the second last.
With the conclusions against the pictures.
Yes.
Those ones. That one.
No? Before your end, yeah. No. Page on.
One.
Again. I may have missed it, but I would like to understand the bottom, yes, that picture that you had just now.
Okay, just ask your question and then
yeah, the bottom left.
Yes.
How is the bottom left and the construction? I think it looks like RDP houses. How is that not a CIDB? How can we not then classify it as a CIDB? Because in the bottom left one, it is construction. They are constructing a house which is in somebody's view an asset, be it for just house, yeah, and that other one of the RFPs. Maybe you have explained it, but I may have missed it in the discussion.
Yeah, so yes. It goes back to what is on the screen now, the exemptions out of Regulation 4 of the CIDB regs. And exemption number 1 is that when it is home builders or work related to NHBRC, like we've got it shown on that slide, when it's work under the auspices of the NHBRC, the Register of Contractors is not applicable. So it's construction, but there's an exemption applicable to that. Does that mean you cannot do CIDB? Again, it goes to that very last discussion that we had. So also way back in 2013, 2014, for some of our housing projects, we do advertise based on CIDB also, because CIDB does give you that first step in comfort towards a risk analysis that you're going to deal with a contractor capable of doing the work, which NHBRC unfortunately does not. So there are times, or there were times, I've not seen any of our tenders of late, so I'm not sure what we do of late, but there were a very long time that we were advertising our top structure tenders, that you must be NHBRC compliant, and that you must have the relevant CIDB compliance. Before we did that, though, we went to all of the big all of the big players in our area. They were all already registered with CIDB anyway, so there was a very small procurement risk one way or the other that we're going to exclude somebody by adding the CIDB requirements into it. Once we've done that market research, we went and engaged with CIDB at that stage also to say, help us here. Are there any players that are in that market that we are not aware of, that we've missed? And are you in favor of us utilizing this requirement in our tenders? And at that point, they were in favor of it. So again, to Richard's point, the risk at that stage for us to have just said NHBRC without any additional categorization or additional accreditation for suppliers was just too great. And for that reason, we felt let's do it as CIDB contracts also. So I hope that gives you a twofold answer. The reason why we've put those two slides as being part of the exemption is purely because they are related to home building.
Good one. Thanks, Arno. Are you saying that even if it is exempt, it does not preclude you from using and applying the codes and the register?
And Richard affirmed that also. We're saying that even if it is, I use the gas line example.
Yeah.
So you don't have to, and you probably shouldn't, and you certainly shouldn't if by doing so, if by disregarding the exemption, you're prejudicing a whole lot of suppliers. Right. So let's go back to our CCTV example. Let's say our data analytics wasn't clear. It's not overwhelmingly supply. So now we're saying, well, okay, we're just going to do this as a EB or EP. Apologies, EB. Sorry, EB. I get confused. We'll deal with that next week with that confusion.
Yeah.
But if the majority of the players in that market is not registered as EBs, we're restricting the market, we're restricting competition, and we're actually going to be paying more for our installation. But like anything where you're starting to go beyond the express provisions of a regulation, etc., and that's to our other point, you've got to back it up. You've got to say, my data analytics showed me I should have applied the exemption. However, my market analysis showed me that the market players are not in place. I engaged CIDB. They concurred that there are no market players, and they supported our decision to go beyond the exemption, either applying it when we shouldn't have, or not applying it when we should.
Very good. Just before we go to Michael, Chris Wilcock has asked about water treatment works, operations and maintenance of a water treatment works.
Yeah, again, it's starting to go into probably more labor elements of it. I think I have a look at the practice notes, the practice note of CIDB. I think they actually use that kind of an example also, where it starts becoming operations, where it's quite clearly not the creation of a fixed asset. I would also argue that in a water treatment works, you're not actually doing anything to the fixed asset. You're running a process. So the tender for the operation of a water treatment works is more related to the provision rather than the maintenance of the facilities.
Thanks,
it could well be that there's components of maintenance and that your operator must keep an eye out on it, etc. But again, where does the big bucks fall?
Yeah.
Is it in the process, or is it in the maintenance?
Great. Frans van der Walt is agreeing with you in essence.
He has to, because he was one of my first bosses. So most of what I've got me.
Oh, well done. Michael?
Sorry, Sean, I'd just like to clarify a couple of points because some of the comments seem to confuse matters a bit. The definition of construction work is the ambit of the construction regulations and nothing else. It's not the CIDB's prerogative to determine what is construction work and what isn't. That is very clearly defined in the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The construction regulations state construction work is, and they list what construction work is. The CIDB regulations provide a framework within which the state is required to, or which the state is required to follow in the procurement of construction work. So they're very different, but the CIDB regulations or best practice guides do not in any way determine what is construction work and what is not construction work. If you look at the example of the generator, if you buy the generator from a supplier, that is a supply contract very clearly. If you place the generator in position and actually connect it, that is deemed to be construction work in terms of the construction regulations. Whether the supply or the procurement of that generator is exempt from the requirements of using a registered contractor and it's exempt from having to follow the requirements of the standard for uniformity, those are two different things. And I think that it's very important to draw the distinction between the two, because some of the comments in the chat box confuse the two. The CIDB has no mandate whatsoever to determine what is construction work and what isn't. That is Department of Labor's preserve. Okay.
Agree with that. The topic of this session, though, is CIDB applicability. It's about the applicability of the CIDB Act and the CIDB regulations. So you are 100% correct. The construction regs and the CIDB regs does not contemplate construction in exactly the same way. There are exemptions in the CIDB framework which are not applicable in the construction regs. Fully appreciate that. However,
well done.
The reality is this specific session had to do with the applicability of CIDB, focusing on the procurement side of things.
Good one. I think Michael's also picking up on the comments in the chat as well, Arno.
So that, absolutely valid point.
Very good. Yeah. Let's
it's always been confusing.
Just quickly check with you how your time is. Are we past the hour? Have you got a couple more minutes?
I'm still available, for sure.
Okay. So Maite Tabane has got some points on the definition of construction works excludes fiber infrastructure. Fibers installed using combined solution. Any thoughts on that one?
What is fiber infrastructure? If it is the sleeves and the manholes and the draw wires, the definition does not exclude it. That is civil engineering. When it starts getting to the installation of the fiber cables, you can probably start going down the road of supply contracts. But if your contract is for the construction of a fiber network for future utilization by third-party suppliers, that network is a construction contract in terms of the definition that we looked at today.
So unless they've separated the actual trenching and from the cable, it would essentially
we've had that a few times also, and it does then become problematic. And again, I suppose one will take Richard's point again. So if it is something where the electronic component is not substantial, but it is critically substantial from a risk-based point of view, you can probably start arguing based on the way he had described it, that maybe you do not want to apply the register of contractors, but purely on the definition of it, one needs to be careful of that regard. So typically that's been our strategy, has been to separate and to try and do the third-party fiber installations separately from the infrastructure. Obviously, sometimes you don't want that. You've let a contract to a specific network of a specific area to a third party. But again, then I would just apply those steps and look for the exemptions and just be clear why you don't want to utilize the exemptions, or there is.
Yeah. And Lwazi's asking a similar question: dark fiber installation commissioning, which is understandably to not be CIDB requirement. Please explain related civil works for which examples are 60% of the total cost.
Yeah, I would be concerned about that.
Yeah.
Obviously, the commissioning would probably be a substantially labor exemptions. But if 60% of your totality of contract is the civil engineering infrastructure related to it, you're starting to get into sort of difficult ground, and you would need to approach any non-application of the CIDB definition with great caution, and be sure that you've got proper decision making, proper support, and proper records on the reasons why you can do so.
Andres from the Eastern Cape is saying, what about the supply and installation of an MRI scanner? I guess that's Department of Health related. Requires major electrical works, much like a generator. Question.
Again, my gut feel would be that the major electrical component will still be insignificant in the totality of the package. That it's going to be the machine that's the cost.
Yeah.
Again, just shooting off the hip, not knowing the full details. We're thinking of all the solar farms that we're putting up all over the country. Some of these big solar farms, you've probably got a civil engineering component running into the millions, the plinths and the cabling, etc. So the civil component is running into the millions, but the supply of the equipment could still be 10 times that. So even those kinds of plants is not necessarily construction, because you have a lot of what we would normally say as construction. Not
necessarily CIDB.
Correct.
It's construction, but it's so even
that's a good example also, where you may feel that an exemption is applicable, or an exemption may not be applicable, but then you need to go do your market analysis to say, so
got you.
Are the players that can do 200 million rands worth of solar plants for us, are they registered with CIDB? If they are not, and you procure in that manner, you go down that road of, is it competitive? Is it market pricing? I think what happened with some of the solar plants, etc., it becomes an encouragement towards CIDB to start actually engaging these players and say, guys, you're doing this work, come and get yourselves accredited, etc. That would be sort of the logical, like we used to do with in our happy days of local content, Sean, when we had to procure a specific commodity where we couldn't find suppliers, we would engage DTI. They would either say to us, you've missed the suppliers, here they are, or they would find the suppliers to get themselves accredited in the various regions.
Very good. You want to go back to your methodology slide? And so just for my benefit, in this process, where does that market research step come in?
Beyond step 5.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, I think again, this isn't necessarily a linear step process, Sean. I mean, when you start to prepare your tender documents, I'm already thinking about my financial analysis. I don't wait until I've made the determination that it's fixed assets. So I think similarly to that market research, if you're starting to get the sense that maybe my commodity is going to fall foul, in inverted commas, of the CIDB definition, and then start doing that market research a lot sooner. So we haven't specifically put it on the map, but probably after step 5. I think it comes to light after step 5 when you've got an outcome based on the methodology and it doesn't make sense. There's something about that outcome that doesn't make sense. Then you want to rely on the market research, etc. That starts getting very late in the process to start doing the market research. So
very good.
Yeah, that would be my guidance, is start thinking of it very soon. And we know who our market players are typically. Start getting that. If you catch it early enough, you can do an RFI in parallel to your procurement process, so that you even get a more informed view on who's
Or
out in the market.
expression of interest.
Something along those lines, yeah.
If you wouldn't mind going back to the first one where you've got your little diagram and the step diagram where you've got the contract form at the top of the staircase there, correct contract form, comma, tender template.
So yeah, that's really, that's a City of Cape Town thing. So our purpose of the presentation was to guide you through the steps so that you start with the right document. We don't want folk to use a tender template, a goods and services tender template, and then at some point they get to BSc number 1, and they then realize it should be construction. So the angle there for us was just talk about construction, the correct template. I think for a substitute to the text in that block could be correct procurement strategy or correct procurement methodology.
It's I mean, it's very relevant. So you're concluding at the end of this process that this is CIDB should be CIDB compliant, and therefore the contract form, the appropriate contract form should be chosen, and not the one for general goods and services that National Treasury use.
Yes, yeah. So we've got the NTGCC, that is one of our templates, our goods and services template, and then we have a series of about, I don't know, 6 or 8 construction templates in the various contract languages and procurement methodologies.
JBCC, NEC.
Yeah, JBCC, FIDIC, GCC, and
FIDIC, and then the
separate between lump sum strategies and framework agreements.
That's right. Good. I think there was one last question. What about requiring to uninstall roller doors and replace them with sliding doors? Seems the supply of the doors will be less than the labor. Includes uninstalling.
Yeah, it's an excellent example. I see your removal of roller shutter doors, and I raise you the demolition of a building. That's also a sneaky one, right at the end of the second line of the act.
Yeah,
there's dismantling, demolition. There's removal is in there. So again, you're touching a fixed asset. Default setting goes straight to see if the exemptions are applicable. The removal of a roller shutter door and the replacement of it with an aluminium door, depending on the nature of the repairs to the reveals and the thresholds and those kinds of things, you may get lucky. Aluminium is not a cheap exercise at the moment. You may get lucky that it is a substantially supplied contract. My gut feel, however, would be that's a construction contract. Or CIDB would be applicable to it.
And your point is, and we'll ask Frans to come in now, but your point is that you want to go through this methodology, you want to document the basis on which you're making these conclusions. It may or may not be 100%, but at least you've gone through this, you've applied some reasonable thinking and some logic in the process, and you documented, and that's the basis on which you do it. If there is real uncertainty, contact CIDB and include their response as one of the inputs to that conclusion.
And before Frans jumps in, the moment there's a specialist category, your vigilance needs to be increased substantially. So we know there's a specialist category for demolition. We know there's a specialist category for curtain walling and aluminium.
Yeah.
So that example of where now it's a supply and install of aluminium components.
Yeah.
CIDB rightly are very protective of their specialist categories. So the moment it's a specialist category, amp up the volume on the due diligence that you do.
Good one. We'll pick up on those S's next week.
Yeah.
Frans, you want to come in?
Good morning, Arno. Thank you very much for addressing us and for the interesting discussion that's taking place. All of the best from a very chilly and white Oudtshoorn at the moment.
Yeah, I thought you would be cold.
Very.
You do remember me that you taught me most of this, right?
Well, I can learn from you lots. Arno, two things which is, to my mind, also fall under the CIDB, and I would like your comment on that. The first of all is the tendency for very low pricing and very high discounts being offered by consultants, and the topic of reasonableness of bids that's being received. We see tenders where consultants offer 70% discount. You know, how can that be accepted by any public entity? The fact that they offer those low discounts is a silly and is absolutely cannot be sustainable. I'm curious as to your sentiment on that. And then the next item is the growing tendency of public entities to adopt the NEC contract on most of their contracts, most of their projects that they're putting out to tender. You know, the CIDB provide for various types of tenders or contracts to be used, and the NEC is certainly one of them, but it goes back to a sentence before that, to my mind, and that is the most appropriate form of contract for the building or the contract to be executed that should be considered, and not the fact that the NEC may be listed. Because to my mind, it's absolutely, I would caution any public entity to actually use the NEC because of very many reasons. I can go into detail in that if somebody wants to discuss it. I'm curious as to your sentiment on those two items, the discount, excessive discounts being given, and also the choice of most appropriate choice of contract.
Cool, yeah, thank you, Frans. So on the first topic, the discounting, your dream will come true with the new CIDB Act, where they want to bring consultants in under their auspices. Currently, the consulting services CIDB, although they tried to dabble in it some time ago, they don't have the mandate for it. They've got their contract conditions, which is what we utilize. But at the moment, the level of control in that regard doesn't sit with CIDB. As you're also aware, Frans, the whole built environment fraternity as of 2015, 2016 has been in the bad books with Competition Commission. The mother bodies are engaging all of the time. So the whole thing about discounting and all the rest, Frans, it's I think it's going to be a bit beyond what we can discuss right now. It is a problematic, absolutely it is problematic. Are we seeing the negative outcomes of it? To an extent, we are seeing it through insufficient service delivery. It's a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing to determine a sustainable price for a consulting service. Far more difficult than it is to do it on a construction tender, where we can phone suppliers, we can get material prices, etc., and start working out a first principle basis. So I don't know. I don't have a direct answer for you on that, Frans. I think it's going to be a function of the mother bodies together with the Competition Commission together with CIDB when they put PSP services under their wing to try and find a solution for that. Just remind that the second topic was about
the choice of contract form.
NEC, yes. So, Frans, I'm hoping that I will be retired before we need to work on NEC. I do agree with you. It's something that, it gets used a lot. I think the NEC marketing strategy, I think, is probably the best out of the lot. It's a buzzword. There's some beautiful articles written about it, and it does seem to be it's told as this miracle cure. We are dabbling with it, but at pilot levels. Currently we're doing a professional services tender on an NEC pilot, and my management is quite wide-eyed before we jump boots and all into it. We realize that there are substantial capacitation issues internally within our organization to administer that contract, and more importantly, our contractor base doesn't speak that language either. So, to your point about the appropriate contract, I think we would be shooting ourselves in the foot if we just overnight decide we're going to go NEC. We will be increasing our tender prices, we will be increasing our risks, and certainly we would be battling to administer it. So it's a journey. I like a lot of the philosophy of NEC, and I think it's a natural progression for us to go to at some stage. But it is a maturing process on a lot of sides of the fence, client side, contractor side, and professional agent side of it. So it's not a yes, pull the pin. I think that is risky. That's the view my management took.
Very interesting. We might have to have a separate topic just to talk about the different contract forms. Hey?
Yeah, for sure.
Michael, last question, and then we can release on
I'd just like to make a point for France. The word discount is probably the most hated word in the professional service providers industry, because what it does, it effectively reduces the provision of intellectual services to the provision of a commodity.
Yeah.
We don't provide a commodity. We basically price an unknown. And half the problem is that the unknown is really poorly defined in the bid documentation. So you don't really know what you're expected to provide. So when I teach my students, I always say, please, if you use the word discount, you're out of the door. Use reduced fee for a reduced service. So when the fees are reduced by 70% of the expected target, then you should expect to receive 70% less service compared to what you would expect if the fee was the full amount. And then that puts things into a different perspective. But so long as we keep on using the word discount, it's just like buying pencils and erasers. If that's if that's the intention, to reduce intellectual professional services into, well, then that's the end result.
70% less service / value. Good one, Michael. Thank you.
And increased risk to the client.
Zara's asking, may we have a session about the use of various forms of contract when using design build implementation strategies? Yeah, good.
That's a nice one.
It's a very good one. Thanks, Zara. Arno, just to express huge thanks to you for the time, for the preparation of the content that you've put together, for your willingness to share this. You may not know that this was the highest attendance we've ever had on a Wednesday at 10 session.
Whoa.
Over 150 people. So that was great. Thank you very much. And we'll certainly looking forward to next week. As we discussed last week, this is a big topic. So nice and pleased that we did separate it into two. And thank you for making the time as well next week.
Sean, I will just send you an updated presentation. I made a few tweaks this morning, so you can delete the one I sent earlier. I'll just send you something after this meeting that you could share.
Thanks very much. I did see that there were some changes, but just for those that on the chat, I have shared a version that Arno had last week. If you do want the updated version, just drop me an email and we'll be able to send that to you. Arno, huge thanks again. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone. Stay warm, stay safe. Ciao.
Yeah, and you guys in the Western Cape, eh?
Thank you. Ciao.
All your rain.